Sega introduces ratings, Nintendo beats Tengen, and Sony buys Psygnosis. These stories and many more on this episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
I've been waiting a long time for a chance to say this. Stop the presses.
Requiescat in pace.
Makes them crazy, man. What is a man?
It's me, Mario.
What a mess.
Get over here!
Please save me.
Welcome to the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine, the show where we travel back in time to find out what was making headlines in the home computer and video game industries of yesteryear. I'm your host, Carl, and I'm joined again by everybody's favorite co-host, Alex.
Hey, good to be here.
The returning champion who has conquered the Dragon Con.
That's right. At the time of this recording, just under a week ago, Dragon Con ended. As I mentioned last time I was here, myself and my co-host at my They Create Worlds podcast, Jeffrey Dahm, presented a panel on the making of The Seventh Guest, and it was very well received. I think we must have had at least 100 people in the room. I didn't count, but it was a very full room, and they laughed in all the right places and none of the wrong ones, so I think that means they enjoyed it.
So there were places they were supposed to laugh at.
Oh, yes.
Excellent.
We got to have some fun with it.
And did you guys do any big advertising ahead of time? Were you promising free cookies? Why did anybody show up to listen to somebody talk about The Seventh Guest?
Well, they were probably in the Westin anyway, and we're like, we need something to do. Why not? No, it's interesting because, of course, I did ask, at the beginning, who all has played, The Seventh Guest, or is familiar with The Seventh Guest, and not many hands went up. It was a younger crowd. They were, I don't have a survey to know why they came, but they were obviously following the gaming track, saw it on the schedule, and thought it might be an interesting hour. And I think they feel they were correct about that. But yeah, it was not just Seventh Guest aficionados, but people who were there to do some learning.
Awesome. And it wasn't just because somebody important was in the room after you.
No. They clear the rooms. They clear the rooms at Dragon Con. So
yeah, that's true. That's true.
Unlike most big conventions, they do clear every room at the end of each talk. So in this case, I know that they were there to see me.
Excellent.
And Jeffrey. And also shout out to Ken Horowitz of Sega 16, who was attending the con, because it's awesome, and was nice enough to attend my panel as well.
Very cool. And you even met some adoring fans afterwards during your work as a volunteer, correct?
I did.
So
yes,
Alex has got himself some groupies.
I apparently do. Yeah, I work the information desk at Dragon Con, and maybe about an hour after the event, I was at one of the desks. And these two, I think college-age probably girls came up, to ask a question at the desk, and then they kind of looked at me and they were like, "Did you just do a video game panel?" And I was like, "Yes." On The Seventh Guest, I was like, "Yes." And they're like, "You were amazing." And, gave some other compliments after that as well. So, yes, apparently so. And hopefully we got some new fans of the podcast as well, because, of course, also did a survey of that, and there were even a smaller number of hands than raised their hands for having been familiar with The Seventh Guest that were familiar with They Create Worlds. We did have a few, but hopefully some of them go on to check out the podcast as well.
I know I've started following people after seeing them at Dragon Con panels, so there you go. It's good press, man. Good press.
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, then, we have a lot to do, and no, everybody who listened to the last episode, which was 4.5 hours long, not that much to do.
No, we'd have had a strike on our hands, like over at the SAG-AFTRA, if we kept up with that.
Yeah, no, it's a regular sized episode again, people. Don't worry. There's not going to be a repeat of that one, at least for a while. So they were heading back 30 years to July of 1993. And remember, everybody, just the public service notice, we're using the cover dates of magazines and newspapers. Therefore, there's always going to be a little bit of discrepancy. Stuff always happened a little bit before that or a little bit later, whatever, depending on what the publication date was. And it's just a way for us to organize information. Please don't send me any letters about the exact dates of stuff. But you can still send us letters, comments, give us a thumbs up on any app that you see us on, blah, 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 blah.
Wait. You get letters, like, in your mailbox? In front of your house?
No, because they haven't tracked me down yet. No, but you can send us correspondence. You can send us emails, videogamenewsroomtimemachine@gmail.com. I read them all. I try to answer them all, at least in a timely fashion. And so, bring it on. All good. And you can also support us on Patreon, link in the show notes below, where you will get early access to things like the interviews. And we have a couple of really nice ones up there right now that are exclusive to the Patreon, including a guy that literally I started talking to him just because I'm absolutely obsessed still with the Chuck E. Cheese Cadaverscope project. And I'm still conducting interviews about that with people. Yes, so the first of those interviews is with Owen Rowley, a name that I had not run across before, but this guy is basically the Forrest Gump of the technology world.
Nice.
His stories are just amazing. He pretty much invented the mouse pad. You have to listen to the interview to find out. But yeah, he's seen it all. He's been there, and he was the guy running the servers, the computers that were supposed to be creating the Cadaverscope cartoons for Chuck E. Cheese. So that and many, many other things. Good interview. It's up on there right now for you to enjoy if you are a patron. So with that being said, you could also, if you're a patron, watch the video version of our first segment, the 7 Minutes in Heaven, where our intrepid co-host must play a game that was reviewed in a publication dated July of 1993 that they've never played before for 7 minutes. And we had a ton of classic games that really were of their era. We had Flashback on the Amiga. We had Strike Commander, the great origin flight sim that pushed hardware to its limits. We even had the Sega CD/Mega CD version of Final Fight. We had the weird French game Inca. But we went with, well, a game that you've been wanting to play for a while, Alex. And here's your excuse. One of the dying embers of the NES, Mighty Final Fight. Are you ready?
Let's do it.
Awesome. Welcome back, Alex, from your 7 Minutes in Heaven. So, for the uninitiated, how would you describe Mighty Final Fight?
Well, I would describe it quite simply as chibi Final Fight. For those that aren't familiar with Final Fight at all, it is a beat-em-up. It's kind of one of the true classics in the field. I mean, you had your pioneers like your Renegades and your Double Dragons, and Final Fight came out kind of in 1989, kind of at the peak of this. and was just a really great exemplar. It was, of course, ported to the Super Nintendo, but a few years later they decided they wanted to milk it a little more on the NES, especially since they had to leave some characters and some stages out of the SNES version because it was an early game. They didn't have the cart space. So it's sort of Final Fight, as you may be familiar with it from these other forms, but because it needs to be done on the NES, they can't use the very big sprites that the original game was well known for, so they went completely in the opposite direction and went chibi with the big heads on the little bodies. And mostly sort of recreated the original arcade game on the NES. Yeah.
And it's fun to see because it's, like we said, it's being reviewed the same month as the Sega CD version, which was a very complete version, especially for the standards of the time, of the arcade game. I can't remember exactly when Final Fight Guy comes out on the Super NES, which was the one still single players and only two choosable characters, but they traded out Cody for Guy. Can't remember when that comes out.
And then I think Final Fight 2 on the SNES was also on our list this month as well. Yes, it was. So, yes, big drop of Final Fight games by Capcom here across all the platforms.
Yeah, it's kind of weird what they're thinking. I mean, is it none of the ads advertise the three versions simultaneously. Mm-hmm. So is there a synergy that we're not seeing? Is it pressure maybe from one of the console makers not to be left out? Mm-hmm. Especially because Capcom's relationship with Sega or releasing games on the Genesis is still not all that solid.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, I don't know what the answer is, but it is kind of weird that all these games are coming out at the same time.
Absolutely.
Okay, so would you recommend this game to modern players?
I think I would. I mean, you have to understand that the NES was somewhat limited in its ability to do beat-em-ups well. All of the beat-em-ups in the arcade at the time really did rely on big, bold, well-animated sprites. They relied on you being swarmed by enemies, kind of being in these desperate spots where you have to work together to clear them all. And the NES hardware just didn't do a very good job of that. So if you're hoping to see Final Fight as it was in the arcade in the home, obviously it's not going to happen. There are only two enemies on the screen at a time. There's lots of flicker if you're not using an emulator with some flicker correction, because they're really straining the ability of the NES to display even the characters they do have on the screen. So it has those limitations. But having said all of that, the character design is just delightful. They get a lot of detail into those little chibi sprites. It's really well animated. The moves flow into each other very well. And, I had a fun time playing it. So if you're into that genre, it's definitely worth playing. If you're not, it's not the game that's going to convince you that you should be. But if you're already into beat-em-ups, give it a try. It's fun.
Yeah, and as somebody who has played it as well, I can only agree. Okay, well, then we finish that segment, but before we can turn on the time machine to find out what was going on back in July of 1993, we have to check in with our good friend Ethan, the warden of the Department of Corrections, to find out what we got wrong in our June of 1993 jump.
Hello, this is a prepaid collect call from
the Department of Corrections.
This call is subject to recording and monitoring. To accept charges, press 1. You may start the conversation now.
Welcome back, Ethan. So, before
Carl,
we get started...
you survived?
Yeah, somehow, I don't know how it was so hard. But yes, we got through the 4.5-hour epic episode that was July of 1983. And now I'm here to take my lumps for everything that I got wrong in June of 1993.
Indeed, that is the case.
Do we have a comment before that?
I forgot to write one down, so just hi, Alex. That's it. He did go to the Dragon Con, and he did do the thing.
Yes, he did. And I'm sure that at some point in the near future, a video version of it may or may not be available to patrons of They Create Worlds. I'm plugging somebody else's podcast. So
it's cross-referencing, okay?
Yeah, that's it. People just sign up to mine too, please. Okay, now let's do this. What did I and or Alex get wrong?
Alex getting something wrong. But in June 1993, let us go, Department of Corrections time. Firstly, the EA carts on the Genesis. They did not always use the yellow tab. They did eventually go away from that as a style on their carts.
Yeah, that was just at the very beginning, right?
Yeah, I think they did it for a little longer than just the initial set, but they did eventually get away from it.
Gotcha. And it was them putting them on there, or were they manufacturing them or having somebody else manufacture them?
I believe that the terms they had with Sega once they came to everything that they would be able to manufacture their own cartridges.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's kind of what I remember from my interview with Michael Katz, but I wasn't sure anymore.
Yes, and so on and on it goes. Electronic Arts and their ways of strong-arming on a platform. Yeah.
Oh, well. Nintendo can't have all the fun. So.
Nextly, the Satellaview platform, the name of the company is Saint Giga.
Saint Giga. Okay. Giga. Is that a specific word in Japanese?
No, I believe it is mainly just a computer-style reference, and Saint is just a suffix, cool, as they do. Yes.
Saint Dragon.
Kakui, as they say.
I'll take your word for it.
Final one. Barcode Battler. It did have more than just a number on it. There were more stats inside of that thing than just a simple number. It is still a crude experience, but it could have been the Pokemon of its day, damn it, except it came down... Yeah. No, it couldn't. No.
No, it wasn't going to happen. There was no way you were making a Saturday morning cartoon out of that. Oh, okay, I should take that back. The Japanese would have found a way. I just don't think it would have been successful. Okay.
Yeah, as far as I know, Barcode Battler was decently successful in Japan, but don't know.
Yeah, no, that's also what the news reports were talking about, that it had sold already buku quantities. It just, for some reason, did not really catch on in the West.
Alas, except not alas, can die in a fire. But it was a noble effort by the people behind it. And that is what we have for June 1993. I'll see you next time for July 1983.
Until then, good sir, thank you as always for your service.
Yeah.
Oh, we got off pretty light on that one, didn't we?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like we're getting good at this. Or it's more like, I'm still passable, and thank goodness you're here.
Well, you said it, not me. But, yeah, the cartridge thing, I don't know. I mean, the history of all of that is complicated. Fascinating, but I haven't done a lot of research on, various cartridge variations from people manufacturing their own. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's yeah. It was distinctive, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Now, with all of that detailed crap out of the way, let's get into some more detailed stuff by turning on the time machine and heading back to July of 1993.
The best possible game.
1993. System.
Kid to point a gun at a television set.
Welcome back to July of 1993. Alex, what's our first headline?
Well, we're jumping right back in with our yellow tab friends as EA sales way up.
Electronic Arts announced that its fourth quarter revenue, ending in March of 1993, was up 61% to $8.5 million compared to the previous year, with most of the increase due to cartridge game sales.
Those sports titles are making bank.
Yeah. But and when you think about where EA started, we're computer games. Yeah. And this complete turnaround where now it's the cartridge games are wagging the dog. Mm-hmm. It's interesting, especially this is the moment when Sillywood is beginning to move.
Yes.
And EA is basically like, yeah, sure, you guys go do that. Madden 95?
and to Tripp's credit, and I realize at this point in time he's handed over the reins to Larry Probst for the day-to-day running, but he's still the one that got them into cartridges in the first place. So to Tripp's credit, he did not want to do it. He's been very candid in interviews that he basically faced a board revolt where they said, we don't care about your artistic integrity. Get on the platforms that make us money or we'll get us someone who will. And, he was dragged in kicking and screaming. But once he was there, he embraced it and he pushed the company there. And, of course, Larry, who very much wanted to be in that market because he was definitely cared more about making the money than the artistic integrity, too. He continued to push them in that area, and they experienced this great success.
Yeah. And I mean, $8.5 million doesn't sound like that much for the fourth quarter, especially by modern standards of what EA must be generating on a minute basis.
Well, and we also do have to remember, though, that their quarters are not tied to calendar years. So their fourth quarter is January to March.
Oh, that's right. It's
the post-Christmas.
Yeah, it's post-Christmas. You're right. So, okay, but still, yeah, this is good money, and it's just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger going forward.
That's right. They're not the only ones, though, that are seeing the big money rolling in at this period of time, as the Japanese game makers had bumper 1992.
With many Japanese game makers reporting earnings after their fiscal years ended March 1st, it looks like 1992 was a good year to be a game maker. Nintendo saw revenues up 10.9% at $5.5 billion. Their exit from coin-op wasn't a factor in the relatively slow growth, but their surging rival Sega was, who saw a 62.6% increase in revenues to $3.4 billion. Capcom saw a whopping 98.2% increase on the back of the Street Fighter II phenomenon, resulting in revenue of $690 million. Namco's revenues were $642 million, Konami's $454 million, Tecmo's $141 million, while Jaleco saw their fall slightly to just $133 million.
Yeah, I mean, 1992 was really the peak from an economic perspective, and you can see that playing out here. I mean, people, the NES was kind of held on to slightly too long for a variety of reasons, and so people were really hungry for that 16-bit content. And as the game makers got more and more comfortable with those systems and could release more and more games of high quality, like the Street Fighter II from Capcom, there was just such an eager market that was primed and ready to buy, which would then lead to some overestimation on how much people wanted to buy in the next couple of years. But that is a story for another episode.
Yeah, and this is the main reason why I wanted to include this, because this really is and we're going to talk about it later in the show. I mean, the next generation of consoles is already sort of on the horizon. But this is the peak moment of the 16-bit, or I mean, it's going to go a little bit higher yet, but this is where the 16-bit systems are in full bloom. And I think that you're also seeing, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but you're really seeing the effects of the fact that the kids who played the NES did not stop playing.
Mm-hmm.
So the new kids coming afterwards are not replacing them. They're adding to the market.
Exactly.
And it's the first time that we've had that, because the original machines in the 80s, basically you aged out of them. Nobody was moved from the, or there were people who kept playing, obviously.
Always,
but
yeah.
It wasn't a significant portion that just kept playing from their ColecoVision to their NES. Instead, they started over again with the kids.
Right. Both because of the crash, but also because they were still seen both by the companies and by parents as something more for 6 to 12-year-olds, whereas Sega has been successful in positioning the Genesis as a system for teenagers. So it's not just that we didn't have a crash, it's also that the content is getting more mature, which, of course, we'll start seeing rumblings about perhaps in this very episode.
Yeah. All of this is coming together. It's one of those episodes where, similar to our 40-year jumps, there's a lot going on and it's all influencing one another at this point. It's another episode of big stories.
Absolutely. And we mentioned that huge surge from Sega. There's definitely more to talk about there as Sega's Nakayama sees bright future.
An extensive profile of Sega, its current head, Mr. Nakayama, and the company's U.S. origins appears in the New York Times. The company is trying to run with its current Genesis success, enter the VR space, and large amusement park-style rides, in part to stick it to Nintendo, but also to not fall like Atari did by being too reliant on one product. Without a major footprint in Japan, though, this may be tough.
And I could do an entire episode on this and have done multiple episodes on this in my own podcast. We'll try to keep it brief here, but Nakayama had great ambitions, and we have to remember Nakayama was a coin man. That's the industry he grew up in, and that's the industry he understood. He did this console thing because he understood that there was a crisis in coin-op that we talked about as we were leading up to the release of the SG-1000 in our 40-year jumps. There was a crisis that pushed him into the home market, but he saw location-based entertainment as the core DNA of what Sega was. And he truly did. It's not just hype for the profile. He truly did want to challenge Disney. That's where he wanted Sega to go, much more than this whole console thing, which was kind of a sideline for him.
Yeah. And you see that I always felt at the time, that held the game designers at Sega back.
Mm-hmm.
They never really crack what makes a console game work well.
Right.
They never had the design philosophy that led to that perfect flow that you get in a Mario game or
Absolutely.
The Metroidvania style game. They never really cracked it. It kept being about the coin-op style experience, the jump in, play, simple mechanics, not a lot to learn over long periods of time, and just wow you with the next visual effect in the next level.
Absolutely.
And it's kind of sad.
And part of that also comes from Nakayama's personality as well. He did not have that same innate sense that Hiroshi Yamauchi did. Neither of them were game players. They had that in common. But Yamauchi just had this innate sense of what belonged in a video game and what made a video game great. And Nakayama, who had many talents, this isn't to diss him, but he didn't have that. One of the stories that I think is hilarious that Yu Suzuki told once is that they would try whenever Nakayama came down to not have any of their projects that were really early in development up and running when he walked in, because Nakayama would come in and see maybe a pretty image on the screen or a pretty animation on the screen and say, that looks amazing. We're ready. Let's ship it. But they haven't done the gameplay yet. They've just basically got a tech demo going. And so Suzuki would have to try to hide early projects from him to stop him from ordering them to send it out immediately. And I think there was very much this sense of like you said, always just chasing that new special effect, that new high, that new thrill, and not always thinking about how it all fit together. And some of that was probably just arcade designers that weren't used to the flow of a console game, but I think some of it was also Nakayama's impatience with letting products sit long enough to find that flow sometimes, if that makes sense.
Oh, definitely, definitely. I mean, it almost feels like the first time Sega truly embraces that in their internal design is when you get to Shenmue on the Dreamcast.
Yeah.
It's the first time, but by then it's too late.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we got to say one more thing about that $3.4 billion that has Sega looking so good right now. And this will come up again as we advance. But one thing that I learned very recently by translating some Japanese interviews and covering this in some of my later more recent podcast episodes is that there was some smoke and mirrors in that number because Sega at this time did not, and were not required by law, they did not report their revenue on a consolidated basis, which means they did not include the overseas subsidiaries in their results. And the reason this was a problem is that Sega of America, and also Sega in Europe, but this was particularly bad for Sega of America, actually purchased their inventory from Sega Enterprises, basically through a loan from the parent company. And so the parent company had receivables on Sega of America, which book as revenue, on inventory that had not been sold yet in America. And Sega of America had, collectibles on that. So they had debt on those receivables. And if they reported on a consolidated basis, those numbers would cancel each other out. But because they don't, they get to report all of the revenue on those receivables on the Japanese end, and none of the unsold inventory that Sega of America and Sega Europe still owe them money for. Which is why in a couple of years, when it turns out that there's an inventory backup in other regions, they will suddenly go from these huge revenues and these pretty big profits to suddenly massive losses when they start re-reporting figures on a consolidated basis. Little accounting trivia there, but it's really interesting.
Oh, yeah, no. And it's inflated, and that $5.5 billion from Nintendo is, I mean, you've got still relatively strong sales of the NES. You've got very strong sales of the Super NES, and the Game Boy is running like hotcakes.
Yep.
And they're at $5.5 billion, and Sega's supposed to be at 3.4. This is when you start going, bullshit. This is when you really, really wish you could go back in time and start short selling that stock.
Yes. Because it turns out it was bullshit, because it turns out that there was unsold inventory in Europe and America that Sega Japan was legally booking as revenue because they didn't have to report on a consolidated basis and tell people about those debts in the subsidiaries.
Crazy. Oh, well, let's keep moving on. Since we're already talking about arcade fever.
Yep, let's keep that arcade fever going, and let's go to another one of those successful Japanese companies as Namco goes to China.
Over 2,000 Japanese firms signed deals to begin doing business in China in 1993. Among them is Namco, which has begun a joint venture with a Chinese state-run company to begin running game centers in Shanghai and manufacture games in the country. The $1.35 million startup costs were carried 70% by Namco, and they expect sales of $1 million in the first year.
Yes, Masaya Nakamura was always incredibly aggressive about overseas expansion. They went into Hong Kong very early. They had an American subsidiary before most other Japanese companies did. Just for licensing, they didn't have a factory, but still, they were there very early. He's always been very ambitious and aggressive. And, of course, Sega, there's a good contrast between Sega and Namco because they were the two top arcade companies in Japan. They were solid competitors, and they had a lot of the same aims, wanting to expand the footprint of coin-op, go into more rides and attractions and theme park type stuff. But one thing that separates them is Nakamura was actually a gamer. I mean, he would sometimes, if they had a good game, he would sit and play it for hours. And I think in some ways he had a little better sense of the games than Nakayama did, and he certainly had some keen instincts on when to expand. And so, even though right now Sega's the bigger of the companies because they have all that console stuff going on too, Namco is not gonna quite hit those same lows as competitor Sega, because they're a little smarter about what they're doing.
Yeah, definitely. And it's also interesting just to see, and this comes out of a lot of the newspaper articles I'm reading at this point in time, with the fall of the Soviet Union a few years earlier. Mm-hmm. Now the question is, what becomes of China?
Yes.
Will China follow the same path? Will they embrace the open market? And the fact that so many Japanese companies, given the animosity between China and Japan stemming from World War II, that so many Japanese companies are being able to get in there is being seen by many in the West as, okay, China's open for business. This is the beginning of mass manufacturing deployment into China, creating the industrial supply chain that we have today. And it's all coming very, very quickly, all at once, at this moment in time, and still with these restrictions that the outside companies are not allowed to actually own or control what's going on. They're allowed to put in the money, they're allowed to set it up, but they're not allowed to actually own it. But everybody's thinking this is going to be the market to be in, and this is why they're willing to take that risk and put in that money.
And of course, the Japanese companies understand how to navigate that space, because as Japan was building up its economy in the 50s, 60s, 70s, etc., they had some of those same stipulations where you had to go in on joint ventures. That's why you have, to bring it back to video game companies, that's why you have, say, JVC, Japan Victor Corporation, because, Victor couldn't go in themselves. IBM had joint ventures, all of that. So it's a system that the Japanese are used to being on the other side of, but they're also very familiar with as a concept.
That's true. That's very true. So, yeah, interesting to see the developments.
Absolutely. And speaking of things developing, we have an ongoing story here that might come back in a few months. The press discovers violent games.
The coin-op biz is coming under increasing media scrutiny for violence in games. Mortal Kombat is the lightning rod, with trade publications like Playmeter getting an ever-increasing number of press inquiries on the topic and media reports, especially in newspapers, potentially creating a very anti-coin-op public backlash.
Yeah. This might come back. Of course, there's so many things going on here. There's a new level of graphical fidelity that hasn't been seen anymore. There's always this idea that realistic looking violence is worse than cartoon violence, which is why Looney Tunes is fine, and why Street Fighter 2 even is fine. And we have these digitized graphics, which make them seem more human. And obviously there's the fatalities too, but I think if Street Fighter 2 had fatalities of a similar type, it wouldn't have necessarily occasioned the same comment, because it's that digitized graphic element. And then you also just have the fact that the audience is aging. This is less maybe of a thing in the coin op than it will be when these things come home. But as we said, the audience isn't aging out of video games so much. This is the generation that is growing up with video games and continues to age with video games. And so there's still kind of a perception in minds, especially because of how heavily Nintendo marketed to children in the home, that video games are kid stuff. And so there's increasing discomfort with mature ideas or mature themes showing up in video games.
Oh, clearly. And let's face it, Mortal Kombat is in many ways living off of or successful because of the controversy it's very deliberately trying to create.
Absolutely.
I mean, there's no doubt about it. I mean, you don't create a game where a guy rips off out another guy's heart without wanting to cause a stir a little bit.
Absolutely.
And we've already talked in previous episodes how the home ports have been announced, how it's already been announced that the Sega version will be unedited, the Nintendo version will be edited. All of that is already in the cards. Everybody knows it's coming, at least in the video game world knows it's coming. The fact that the mainstream newspapers, as we've said many times before, are always behind the times. The fact that they're starting to pick up on this,
yes,
means that it's that the press is geared up. And the worst part is, of course, because it's first coming out of the arcades, by the time it hits in the home, these guys have basically already written the articles. They just need to switch out, coin op with console, and they can just reuse all the media material that they've already got.
Absolutely. And, as they said, I mean, it doesn't end up being too huge a deal in the arcade just because the home market kind of overshadows that because there is the greater emphasis on children there. But it's no surprise that as these rumblings are starting, that it would be the coin-op companies that would be very sensitive to this first. Before the companies that are more focused on the home, which is why, while Nintendo and Acclaim are going on kind of at this point, I think it's fair to say blissfully unaware, we do see that even at this juncture, Sega introduces rating system.
Oh, yes. On May 23rd, Sega unveiled their decision to introduce a 3-tier rating system starting in August, following the refusal by Toys R Us in Canada and the UK to carry their game Night Trap. While a major media outcry over the game in Australia has led coin-op operators to start their own, quote, seal of approval program to label games that they don't think are appropriate. The 3 tiers are GA for general audiences, MA13 for mature audiences with parental discretion, and MA17 for adults only. This follows U.S. Senate hearings in May and June targeting TV producers because of the violence of their shows, and 2 bills to regulate broadcast content have already been introduced.
Yep, it's on the way, and Sega can kind of see it before anyone else, both because they're in coin-op and because they have the whole Night Trap Sega CD thing going on. And plus, they've been deliberately trying to age up the audience. I mean, that was part of their marketing plan, was to capture teenagers. And so now that they have research showing that they have been successful in that, I think their leadership also realizes that it's inevitable now that we're not just bringing in the kids, that we have to follow motion pictures and other areas in having some kind of rating for parents or face government regulation, which would lead to disasters. Just look up Hays Code, or if you have any doubt about that.
Oh, of course. And like I just said, with the newspaper articles and the newspapers getting ready for this, the fact that the U.S. Congress had just had hearings on TV, and this is also a moment in time when broadcast television is coming under extreme pressure from home video and from cable,
yes,
to become edgier, because they just look like milquetoast in comparison. I mean,
exactly.
If you look at, what a Miami Vice episode, which was supposed to be gritty at the time in the
Right.
late 80s, when you compared it with what could be shown on cable television, especially with HBO making their own movies at this point and the first made-for-cable TV shows popping up and so forth, they need to up their ante, and Congress is not going to regulate the cable industry, but they sure as hell can easily do something about broadcast and also, make some political hay out of it.
Right.
So they're already in this mode. They're ready to go. It's not hard to rewrite those rules to suddenly say it's video games.
And right, and it's incredible, what was deemed offensive. The big scandal in broadcast television was the new show NYPD Blue, which dared to show a bare butt, in an episode while two characters were having sex, and this was scandalous on network television.
Yeah. Even though it was being shown at like 10:30 at night or something.
Right.
This is the environment that we're in at this moment. So it's all these things coming together. I know I sound like a broken record at this point, but the idea of the aging gaming market, of all these different media formats that are pushing limits without any government regulation, the way broadcast television has been for 30 years at this point.
Right. And Oh, yeah. And I was going to say, and also, quite frankly, it's, the Democrats are back, baby. I mean, Bill Clinton has won the presidency. Of course, at this point, there's still Democratic control of the Congress. And, during the Reagan years, there was so much deregulation that I have to imagine, I mean, I haven't studied this closely or anything, but I have to imagine that, the Democrats were kind of champing at the bit a little bit to reintroduce some regulation where they could, now that they had the levers of power again, as a backlash to the massive deregulation done during the Reagan administration.
That, and also, and this comes from my own memory of the time, there was a certain breed of Democrat that had come into power, this more centrist Democrat that had moved up through the primaries to try to win back some of the Republican voters by being more socially conservative.
Right. Absolutely.
I mean, this is where, Tipper Gore is the one who is championing the parental discretion label on CDs because of foul language. This is where Lieberman, a Democrat, is the one spearheading a lot of these efforts to control content. And these are the people who are in this position in no small part because the Republicans had been so successful on the social messaging that the Democrats started to move more to the right in order to win back some of those voters. And now that they have power, they're basically like, well, I got voted in on this, so I'm going to keep going.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And and these are not really issues that in any major way the Republicans had actually moved on while they were in power. We're not getting any of this during that period. They talked about it a lot, but it was all just about how do we give a bigger tax break. Yes, I'm getting political.
Well, yeah,
people don't like to screw it.
And they were also, pulling the teeth out of the FCC. We talked about it in our 40-year jump when we were talking about the cartoons that were suddenly showing up because they were deregulating at that time. The airwaves. So
exactly.
Right.
Yeah, and it's a very weird moment, and it's going to be some fun episodes coming up. So
yeah, and maybe even some very special episodes in there, Carl. You think?
I think we may have to do a very special episode about that. Yes.
Absolutely. But let's get back to Sega again, and this time a little bit of bad news for the people at Sega as Genesis Street Fighter gets delayed.
Despite reviews already appearing, Street Fighter II Champion Edition for the Sega Genesis has been delayed to September, apparently to coincide with the launch of Street Fighter II Turbo on the Super NES. September, of course, will also see the home ports of Mortal Kombat hit store shelves.
Yeah, I don't know if they thought that they should put it head to head or if there were technical issues. I mean, I don't have any insight into the development, but that seems like a poor choice because
an extremely poor choice.
Turbo, because the progression in the arcade was Street Fighter II, Street Fighter II Champion Edition, Street Fighter II Turbo. Turbo's better. It has everything Champion does, plus it plays faster. And of course, Mortal Kombat is just going to be this juggernaut. That's a very crowded market to try to throw Street Fighter II Champion Edition into.
And this is the thing. I mean, I've interviewed Joe Morici, and he did talk about there was an earlier version of Champion Edition. He wanted it out on the market immediately. Capcom Japan said, no, we need to make sure it's done right. Now, I don't know if that's what he's referring to here, but considering that magazines like Video Games and Computer Entertainment already reviewed Champion Edition 4 months before this announcement.
Right.
And as far as I know, the version that they reviewed is also the version that hit stores. So I don't think it's that. I don't have anything to back this up. I haven't talked to Joe again to confirm or deny this. Right. But this just smells like Nintendo putting pressure on them.
Doesn't it, though? I agree with that.
It does. And it just feels like, you guys are not going to leave us hanging. Now, granted, Turbo's going to come out in time for Christmas. So, I don't know why they would.
Well, but they don't want to, they don't want to lose the people that just can't wait, right? They're afraid that people decide there's not that much difference between Champion Edition and Turbo. So I've got my Champion Edition, so I don't need Turbo now. Whereas if they go head to head, Turbo is the superior product. So if you're only going to buy one when they come out at the same time, you're going to buy Turbo on the SNES. But if you already have Champion Edition, maybe you decide that that's enough and you don't get Turbo. That's the only thing I can think of.
But you'd have to have both consoles because Champion Edition is only coming out on the Genesis.
Well, sure. Right.
Turbo's they're only coming out on the SNES.
Of course. But I think they're probably worried that Champion Edition could drive sales just as vanilla Street Fighter II drove sales of the SNES. But again, you don't need to go buy a Genesis to play Champion Edition if you can just go a little further down that aisle in Toys R Us and pick up a Street Fighter II Turbo on your SNES. I think that's got to be some of the thinking if, and we do stress that this is a theory, if Nintendo put pressure for them to delay it so that they went head-to-head instead of Champion Edition appearing first.
Yeah. Again, it's the only thing that makes any sense under these circumstances. And I mean, both Electronic Games Magazine and Video Games Computer Entertainment both talk about this extensively this month, that this is just an insane move.
Right.
And on top of it, it puts them smack up against Mortal Kombat.
Right.
It's like, why do you want to come out in the same month as MK? If you come out 2 months earlier, you're going to grab people's money, and then they might not go out and buy Mortal Kombat. But taking on at the same time just feels like a nonsense move.
Then on the other hand, Capcom wasn't always making the best decisions in this time frame either. We'll see in a couple of years that they really, really overestimate the North American market a couple of years later, and it nearly bankrupts the company. So, it's there could be shenanigans, or it could be they just got dumb.
That is also possible. That is very, very possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Meanwhile, speaking of things that are actually a little dumb, Sunsoft beats, you didn't put it in quotes, but I will, Action Replay.
Okay. Well, I mean, you got to build up a little bit of suspense. So, Sunsoft claims to have made their Tasmania game, based on the cartoon series of the same name, action replay proof. They claim this will prevent the game players cheating themselves out of the full experience. Of course, this should also help them reduce the phenomenon of people renting the game and playing through it on a weekend.
Yes, which was, of course, the real reason that they hated Action Replay. They hated Game Genie, because they don't care about the integrity of the game experience. I mean, if a player likes to play a game a certain way, they'll be like, go ahead, as long as you're giving us money. But of course, they're not giving them money. They're putting in invincibility and infinite ammo, renting it from Blockbuster, and never buying it because they're done with it. It's not about cheating themselves. I mean, come on.
Yeah. Now, this claim that they actually beat the Action Replay, they didn't beat the Game Genie because both Game Genie and Action Replay work very differently.
Yes.
But yeah, if you look online, there are Action Replay codes for Tasmania. So,
yeah,
they're claiming they beat it, but they didn't.
No.
Yeah. But it is an interesting phenomenon when you look at it from that point of view.
Absolutely. But meanwhile, back at Sega, this is a Sega month for sure. Sega announces Mega Drive 2 and Mega CD 2.
Following a surprise launch in Japan in April, we'll never see that from Sega again, Sega of America announced the U.S. would be getting the new cost-reduced versions of the Genesis and Sega CD. The U.S. names would stay unchanged, but a new pack-in game, Night Trap, would be included, replacing the current Sewer Shark game.
You've got to get the game getting all the press in there.
Now, I actually tried to find boxes, and I couldn't find a box that actually had Night Trap on the cover. Maybe they changed the plan. Maybe it just wasn't visible on the box. Maybe it was a sticker. I don't know. But at least that's the announcement at this point, that they're going to be shipping the Sega CD2. That's the one that's on the side as opposed to underneath the device, with just the flip top instead of the always breaking tray that pops out. And Night Trap. Fun stuff.
Yes. But Sega and Nintendo are not the only companies in the console market now. Let's not forget their competitors, as now there's an announcement that you can hook your Turbo Duo up to your PC.
And your Amiga and Mac. Turbo Technologies, the company selling the TurboGrafx 16 and Turbo Duo in the USA, has announced the Intelligent Link, a SCSI connector that will allow a Turbo Duo to be used as an external multimedia player for PCs, Amigas, and Macs.
This was actually, obviously it doesn't work out for them, but I think this was actually a very smart move. Because they were so early on CD, and like this is right in the period, and we'll see some other stories on this too. This is right in the period where CD is about to take off. And so to try to convince people that, you can have a cool video game system and it can be that CD-ROM drive you're looking for too. Not that it's really a CD-ROM drive, but I'm just saying, because it's a different, media format, but still that it can be that CD drive of some kind on your computer. It reeks a little bit of desperation, but it's one of those things that's worth a shot, because it was probably very little development cost for them, and it provides another way to try to make their system stand out when they're getting trounced in the market.
Definitely. And this thing never comes to fruition. It never actually hits the market. There are images of it. There's even an ad where this thing shows up, but it never actually comes out. The big problem here is that this thing is a single speed.
Yes.
And what media are you going to play on your PC in single speed? You can try to run CDs, music CDs, and stuff that's made for multimedia CDs.
Right.
But you're not going to run a regular PC CD-ROM. You're not going to be running Rebel Strike or Rebel Assault. Sorry,
Rebel Assault.
Assault off of this thing on your 386.
Absolutely not.
So, yeah, I mean, you're right. It was an interesting idea for them, but it's going nowhere fast.
Exactly. But
just like
CD,
the Turbo Duo.
yeah, just like the Turbo Duo. But they're not the only ones trying to capture the multimedia market, as Summer CES belongs to multimedia and networking.
The Summer CES saw the advent of the multimedia age. With many manufacturers showing off new CD-ROM games and hardware, the age of video-enhanced and digital image-based gaming seems to be upon us. From 3DO's debut with games such as Crash and Burn and Jurassic Park, both sporting scanned imagery of real actors, although in the case of Jurassic Park they are stand-ins and not the actual movie actors.
Likeness rights are expensive, people.
Extremely. And if you haven't seen this before, please go and Google it. Oh, it looks so sad. So very, very sad. Now, how those games were going to be distributed and played was also going to be revolutionized, with many companies touting networking initiatives. AT&T was planning to release a cart to allow online competitive play for the Genesis, as well as a team up with cable TV giant Viacom to offer interactive TV programming, and Time Warner promoted a quote-unquote black box to allow online gaming.
Yeah, you know, one of the things I find very fascinating about networking, this is a bit of a tangent, but why not, is that, like, this is one of the only times in tech history where the big companies that existed in other fields actually recognized a threat and pivoted and stopped the newcomers from taking them out. Because, you know, who do you get for the most part your internet from today? You get it from the phone companies and the cable companies. You don't get it from the AOLs, the CompuServes, or the tiny little ISPs that started in somebody's basement because they had some spare bandwidth. And I find it interesting that this is one time where the big companies realized, oh, shoot, there's this other thing coming along, and this could really destroy our business if we let it.
Yeah, and we've talked about this over the last year or so, how the coin-op business is horribly, horribly afraid of the telecom industry coming in and replacing standalone arcade cabinets and jukeboxes and so forth with, you know, streamed data. The same way that piped in music through central sound systems killed the jukebox in a lot of restaurants and other locations. So they're really, really afraid of that. They've been following it. The trade magazines for CoinOp have been following every development in the telecom legal status for the last 2 years, like hawks. And here, I mean, and this is mainly coming from Replay magazine, again, something for the CoinOp industry.
Yep.
So they're looking at this as, holy crap, what new horror is coming to the home systems that's going to siphon even more people out of the arcade. It's fascinating how these guys are trying to do this. And you're right. You still get it from the same big corporations, but ultimately it's because they control the infrastructure. Your local ISP
exactly.
still needs to buy and rent that line from AT&T, and AT&T is like, well, why? Yep. I mean, it's kind of like your rent is always going to be more expensive than a mortgage payment for the simple fact that the guy who owns the house is also still paying a mortgage payment, and they need a profit margin.
Exactly.
So, I don't know. It's scary. But yeah, I mean, everybody's trying to figure it out. It's just the component that's missing for all of these is the internet.
Exactly.
It's just not there yet. It hasn't been opened up as we know it. Now, 18 months later, we have a whole different world.
Absolutely.
But, yeah.
All right. Well, our next story is very near and dear to my heart after my recent Dragon Con excursion. Seventh Guest gets mixed reviews.
Several magazines around the world have begun reviewing The Seventh Guest, the standard bearer for the new multimedia age. While most magazines laud the game, PC Games, a still relatively new German mag, gave it a 73, with a sidebar by one of the magazine's writers talking about how if this was the future of games, 22 simple puzzles wrapped in a gigabyte of glossy images, then it's time for him to pull his C64 out of the attic.
And that's a very prescient review, obviously, about how much of this was smoke and mirrors. But yeah, the majority of outlets raved over this thing. And, obviously I had to think about this a lot when I was putting my presentation together. Why is that? And, the conclusion I came to is that it was smoke and mirrors, but it was incredible smoke and mirrors because they were using one of the very earliest versions of Autodesk 3D Studio. And the thing about that is not just that they could create and texture 3D objects, but they could also do really advanced lighting effects. Because, it's mostly static with just animations as you move from room to room, so you don't need to do fast action. So you could get really, really in-depth on rendering the lighting. And lighting just makes games make anything look so much better. If you take two images with identical polygon counts and identical texture resolutions, and you light one properly and you light one like shit, the one that you light poorly is going to look terrible, and the one that you don't is going to look amazing. And, I was looking at other contemporary games at the time as I was doing this, and it's like, you have great games that came out around the same time as Seventh Guest, like Wolfenstein 3D, like Alone in the Dark. And the gameplay is vastly superior, but they don't look as atmospheric. They don't look as moody because they don't have that great lighting and everything. And so I just think everyone was so bedazzled by how gorgeous the rooms looked, less the actors, but how gorgeous the rooms looked, that they were just suckered in and they kind of overlooked the simple puzzles wrapped around these glossy images,
Exactly. And I mean, it's hard. I'm always reminded, we got an art museum here in town, and they do these wonderful historical retrospectives sometimes. And a few years back, they had an exhibition of art done, I think he was Austrian, this Austrian art forger. And it was stuff that he was doing in the 1920s and 1930s. And it was supposed to be artwork from a famous Dutch master that he was forging. And they had, I think, 6 pieces of his on display. And when you look at them, if you know anything about the Dutch masters, it's a very distinct style, very ultra realistic. And
so focused on lighting. Yeah.
So focused on lighting. None of these looked anything like that. They were all clearly products of the 1920s. And one of the explanations they gave for why people just bought in that these must be the Lost Masters is that they were saying, well, this master who's been dead for centuries at this point, he was so far ahead of his time, and it just felt like the right thing at that moment that they just bought into it. And if you look at them today, you're like, no, there's an incongruity. This doesn't match up. But if you're looking at it in your moment in time, whatever feels right at that moment is going to be impressive as all hell. And I just remember looking at the images of Seventh Guest in magazines because I was an Amiga user and I was never going to be able to touch something like this. But just looking at those images, it didn't matter if the game was good or bad. Hell, I used to play Sierra point and click adventures all day long. So,
Right.
But the idea that I could experience that level of immersion on my computer
was
all I needed. And because, let's face it, a game isn't always, and I know this is going to be sacrilegious for some people, games are not always about, or almost never really about gameplay. They're about they're about how immersive they can be. Are they going to suck you in?
Right.
And
what kind of response do they evoke, emotional or intellectual?
Exactly. Yep. You will forgive all sorts of terrible problems in the technology, terrible problems in design or whatever, as long as it sucks you in to that quote-unquote virtual reality. And my understanding at the time, for those who played the game, for the vast majority, that's what it did. If
yeah.
You were,
yeah. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I was just going to say I did play it at the time, and it was astounding to see that at the time.
Yeah. And so it's perfectly understandable. I just absolutely love this guy's saying, you know, if this is what the future gaming is, I'm out, dude. I'm out. Just going retro and screw it. And I mean, this is C64. We still are publishing C64 magazines in both Germany and England at this point. And he's still saying, you know, it's retro. I'm going that way. So.
Yeah. And, you know, and of course he was the prescient one, because turns out that whole Sillywood thing and glossy images with simple puzzles, you know, was a flash in the pan.
Yeah.
Well, and people did want something more than that.
We're getting more previews of Doom this month. I finally found a preview this month. It's not in the show notes, but there was a preview this month where we see what are the pink demon things from Doom.
They are literally called demons.
Oh,
like that monster demon is literally just called a demon.
Yeah, okay. The first image I found of one of the Doom demons appeared in one of the magazines this month. So yeah, it's
and you see, I really do think that, you know, like if Doom had come out first, you know, it might have been a completely different conversation, because, you know, Wolfenstein had the adrenaline pumping gameplay, but it had that very basic presentation, whereas Doom, even though it's still 2.5D, it has the dynamic lighting. It has, you know, floors of different heights and walls coming together at different angles. It's more immersive than a Wolfenstein, and I have to wonder if I mean, not that the Seventh Guest and Myst and all of them would have suddenly flopped, because there was still a subset that wanted that kind of thing, but I think the conversation may have been very different if Doom had come out a year earlier.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it would have been a completely different world that we would have gone into. But, you know, Doom also needed a bit more processing power than the Seventh Guest did.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And so it was suddenly restricted to a very specific subset of people who could actually run Doom. Whereas the Seventh Guest, I mean, yeah, you can buy an extra CD drive, but you're not going to buy a new processor and extra RAM.
Well, though Seventh Guest did have some pretty high requirements in that area, because it was actually natively an SVGA.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay, video card needed to be SVGA. That's true.
Yeah,
true, yeah.
Yeah.
Didn't think about that. Okay, yeah, so it's still for the elite of the elite.
Yeah, it was, and there was some complaints about that. Computer Gaming World in their review, I only know all of this because I just gave a presentation on it, said that, yeah, this game is great if your system can run it. It did have some problems. It did have some tech problems because it actually did push the envelope as well, just in different ways. You didn't need 60 frames per second of action, but you did need 640 by 480 resolution with 256 colors.
Gotcha. Those wonderful spec days.
Absolutely. Meanwhile, games gum up the works on Office PCs.
Games have apparently become a major source of worry for office managers and bosses. An ever-increasing flood of games are clogging up hard drives and stealing valuable work time. Everything from Comanche to SimCity to L-Fish. Some are proposing that bosses run scanning software over system networks to identify and eliminate game files.
Yeah, I mean, you have... It's the thing that's finally made the PC the gaming machine too. I mean, you kind of have this merging as as PCs have come down in price, as the clone manufacturers have really gotten the price down on PCs at the beginning of the 1990s, and as the pressure to take your work home with you in certain professions has increased as well, you have this merging of the home computer market and the business computer market, with people buying PCs in the home that they can then bring their work home to use. And so, of course, this is a two-way street. It's not now that people are just bringing their work home to their PCs that they bought at home that are now cheap enough to afford. It's also, well, I've got these games at home. Why don't I bring them over to the office and put them on my machine there too?
Very true. Very true. I mean, yeah, the compatibility is there. And also, I think this was interesting for me from the standpoint that it's starting to show a new problem that didn't exist in the pre-networked age. So if you did have a computer at work, if we go back to the 60s and 70s and even very early 80s, it's a mainframe. At best, you have a dumb terminal. Fine.
Right.
The dawn of the IBM PC starts to separate that out, but until you really get a broad acceptance and ease of use of networking technology through Ethernet, this doesn't even become really an issue in an office space. If everybody's just,
right,
working on their standalone PC, and if you need a file from me, I hand you a floppy disk. But the proliferation at this point, due to the cheap clones of large-scale office networks, even in relatively small companies, is creating suddenly this very different idea. And I mean, the big virus scare is also out there at this point. We've talked about that being spread through Leisure Suit Larry a couple of years ago. So,
I just love. I know we talked about it, but I just love the fact that of all games, it would be Leisure Suit Larry, spreading the computer equivalent of an STD.
It makes perfect sense, especially since it happened at a stock exchange. So it's all these stock bros, what game are they going to be playing? Well, of course it's going to be Leisure Suit Larry.
Love it. But yes, security and networks are very much a concern at this time, not just in the workplace, but also at the highest levels of government, as the U.S. government promotes Clipper.
The Clinton administration has endorsed the Clipper security chip as part of their Information Superhighway initiative. The chip would encrypt messages to give users and businesses security when transmitting messages online, but leave open a backdoor for law enforcement. The U.S. government has ordered the chip for several thousand devices, but the willingness of the broader economy to adopt a hardware solution as opposed to software encryption, as well as one that law enforcement has direct access to, is unlikely.
Yeah, I love that. Buy this chip that lets us spy on you. We promise we won't unless it's necessary. Ha ha ha.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Well,
what a naive time.
Also, the fact that it's hardware-based, so upgrading it is virtually impossible.
Exactly.
Means,
And, if you're leaving a backdoor open for law enforcement, it's not going to take long for the hackers to find the backdoor anyway. It's not really secure, even.
Exactly. It's a non-starter, but again, there's this issue. Now, we're starting to see the birth of the networked world that we live in currently. It's being promoted by the government, but at the same time, the government realizes, what do we really open up with this? What's crime prevention on an anonymous internet going to look like? And this proposal is just so damn stupid.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah. Oh, well.
Moving on to the handheld market now, Nintendo launches bare-bones Game Boy.
As the price wars heat up, Nintendo has launched a bare-bones version of the Game Boy for just $50, sans link cable and Tetris.
Yep. Again, this is just like Jack coming in and slitting the throat of TI and their competitors. It's like, okay, fine, you have these fancy color systems that eat up batteries a mile a minute, and you're only slightly more expensive than our system. Well, we'll take out the stuff that makes our system more expensive and just go where you cannot follow.
Exactly. And I mean, a Game Boy without Tetris is like, I don't know, something that really requires something without having that something.
What an analogy, Carl. What an analogy.
It's late, okay? My brain is not totally functioning anymore. Just be thankful, listeners, I wrote down notes ahead of time. So, yeah. No, it's... I don't know. I mean, getting rid of the link cable, I can kind of understand. Getting rid of Tetris is just... It hurts my soul to think that some poor kid got this, and then the mom's like, and I bought you a copy of Double Dragon. And it's like, all I wanted was Tetris, and this sucks.
Oh, man.
Yeah. Oh, well.
But something has to be working for Nintendo and its Game Boy, because Toys R Us drops the links.
In a sign of the ever-increasing dominance of Nintendo's Game Boy, the largest toy retailer in the US, Toys R Us, has stopped carrying Atari's Lynx handheld game console. This follows Atari's closure of its offices in Lombard, Illinois, and rumors of cuts in Sunnyvale, California. The system is still carried by the big three game retailers, Software Etc., Electronics Boutique, and Babbage's.
Today, just known as GameStop.
Exactly. So, yes, the three sisters, which are now just one, are still carrying the links, but yeah, Toys R Us has decided it is no longer of interest to them.
Exactly. Not only because of Nintendo's dominance, but when it comes time that you feel you don't have to deal with Jack Tramiel anymore, you stop dealing with Jack Tramiel anymore.
Well, I mean, at this point, it's Sam Tramiel running the show, in theory at least.
In theory. I mean, I've interviewed Michael Katz just as you have, and I've interviewed other people, and Jack was running the show.
So, I mean, as someone who has made the annual reports for the Atari Corporation for 1992, 93, and 94, a key part of one of the courses he's been teaching for the last 3 years. And I've read through those damn reports way too many times at this point. The 93 report is going to not put the nail directly in the Lynx coffin, but is going to make quite clear that the Lynx does not really have much of a future.
No.
And that's, I think, really a sign here. Even though there is still talk of a lot of new games supposedly coming for the Lynx, and a few more will still appear, Atari already knows that this battle has been lost.
Absolutely. Our final handheld story, I think, is interestingly placed after our 40-year jump. You may recall that we ended our 40-year jump with airlines experimenting with putting electronic games on flights. And now, 10 years later, on the flip side, we have FAA considering game ban.
The U.S.'s Federal Aviation Administration, the government organ responsible for air traffic, is considering a ban on electronic device use on planes due to the possibility of the same interfering with a plane's instruments.
And we still have airplane mode on our devices today.
Oh, yeah. I mean, now granted, at the time, again, this is one of those moments in time when new technology and you don't know what the potential dangers are. So
exactly.
You have this impetus to go too far.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, what is the effect of a Game Gear on a plane? What is the effect of having a laptop with a hard drive in it running, on batteries on the radio communications?
Yeah, or a cellular device, which some people do have at this time.
Exactly.
Even if they're gigantic.
Yeah, they are still quite large, yes.
Yes.
So yeah, they're considering it. They will impose it, as those of us who flew in the 90s will remember. Please turn off all your devices, and then they will find out years and years later that it was not really all that necessary, or at least they make the appropriate adjustments, and then that's all over.
Yes. Now they still insist on closing most things during takeoff and landing, but other than that, you're fine. Moving on to the legal beat, Nintendo beats Atari Games in court.
Nintendo's lawsuit against Atari Games, which sold unlicensed NES cards through its Tengen line, has ended with a jury award for the House of Mario. The jury found that Atari did in fact violate Nintendo's IP when they bypassed Nintendo's lockout chip, but they did not find that Atari violated Nintendo's rights through markings on their boxes informing buyers that the game could be played on an NES.
Here's a pro tip for everybody, guys. If you're going to reverse engineer a lockout chip, don't do it by obtaining the original plans by lying in a sworn affidavit to the patent office.
And this is a much, much longer story, and we can put a link to your episode on the topic for those who wish to know more. But yes, that's exactly what Atari did. It's not really reverse engineering at that point anymore. It's just
it's not. It's just plain copy. Yes, it's just plain stealing at that point.
Yes. So Atari decided to do it on the cheap. And, I have interviewed somebody who may or may not have been in that room when that decision was made. This did not turn out well for Atari. Now, remember everybody, here we're talking about Atari Games. This is the arcade arm that we haven't covered this in the 40-year jumps yet because it still hasn't happened, but this is the original arcade arm of Atari that is doing this. Is not the Jack Tramiel Atari Corporation. That case closed out like 2 years ago. We talked about it on the show back then. And that was about something else. That was about Nintendo's mafia-style tactics to monopolize the market. And here, though, this is really where Atari Games has truly messed up and done a very bad thing. And so Nintendo is going to try to make them pay.
Yes. Absolutely, but Nintendo's not the only one trying to make other people pay, because our good buddies Phillips are still out there launching a barrage of lawsuits.
The old Magnavox Odyssey patents are still causing headaches for game makers. Phillips has launched 8 more suits to recover damages for infringement against Capcom, Data East, Konami, the Leland Corporation, Romstar, SNK, Taito, Tecmo, and TradeWest.
That's right. Kind of the last hurrah here. At this point, I believe the patents have expired, but of course they can still go after infringers from the period of the time when the patents were enforced. So they're kind of like, okay, we can't sue anyone coming into the market. Who did we miss?
Well, who did they miss, or who are they? A couple of these are people who had already settled with them years and years earlier.
Yes.
But Magnavox is saying that either they did not pay sufficient licensing fees over the years, or there were games that should have been covered by the licensing fee that did not get covered by the licensing fee.
Exactly. This is all they can do at this point. They can't go after new companies anymore, so they're mining the old companies for every last piece of 8 that they can extract.
Oh, definitely. Fun.
But it's not all animosity in the court system as Accolade and Sega bury the hatchet.
The long-running dispute between Accolade, a company mainly established in computer gaming, and Sega has ended. Accolade will become an official licensee for the Genesis, and not only will this mean that they will no longer be making their reverse-engineered carts, but they will also get access to Sega's developer tools, which they say will make their games better. Too bad it's coming too late to help games like Turrican, Test Drive, and Bubsy.
But there's still Bubsy 2, Carl! There's still Bubsy 2!
Yeah, don't remind me.
Yeah, I mean, they had to do this. I've talked to people that were there, and I mean, the lawsuit basically killed them. Even though, they sort of won in the end, they were on hold for so long with that it killed them, and they really couldn't afford to antagonize Sega anymore. Because they needed some hits immediately or they were going to be in really big trouble. And Sega could make their lives hard for them again, even after whatever success they had in the Sega V Accolade case, if they didn't kind of kiss up and make nice at this point.
Yeah, and it also makes sense ultimately because the games that they're putting out really are so terribly programmed.
Yes.
So absolutely. I mean, if you've ever played Turrican on the Genesis, it is hard. It is so hard not hard in the sense that it's a hard game to play. It's a hard game to play, but it's a hard game to play in addition to just the bad programming.
Yeah, it's a slog is what Carl is trying to say.
It's painful to the soul.
Yes.
If you have basked in the glory of Manfred Trentz's programming skills on the C64 original, with the ultra smooth scroll and all the characters on the screen and no flicker anywhere, and then you play that sometimes 5 frames a second track.
Right. Yeah, I mean, just from a presentation perspective, Turrican is one of the most advanced and best C64 games ever made. Yeah. And
it's beautiful.
The contrast is noticeable.
Yeah. And then you have the Factor 5 did the Amiga version, which was just as polished but looked nice. And then there's that Genesis thing. It's so sad. But oh well. So Accolade is going to do this, and they're just going to become a hit maker from this point forward.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. That's exactly what's happening. Moving on to some mergers and acquisitions, AT&T buys stake in the Sierra Network.
American telephone giant AT&T has purchased a 20% stake in Sierra's Sierra Network online gaming system with an option to buy the rest of the company later. This comes as the hype for what Bill Clinton calls the information superhighway is mounting, and more companies are scrambling to figure out what the new networked digital future will look like. AT&T is also an investor in Trip Hawkins 3DO and will be bringing TSN content to its own version of the 3DO player.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, this obviously ends up being a kind of stupid deal, and they end up taking the whole thing eventually, but it ends up being a kind of stupid deal for AT&T. But on the other hand, it's so smart because AT&T realizes that even after the breakup of Ma Bell, they are still the giant in the room, and the best way for them to stop one of these upstarts from usurping their place in the telecommunications world is just make sure they have a finger in every last pie. So does the 3DO work out? No. Does the Sierra Network work out? No. But AT&T has the money to burn, and what if one of them did work out?
That's exactly it. I mean, and these are pre-made things. I mean, we talked earlier about how at CES there's all these different attempts. Is it going to be a set-top box? The set-top box thing is something we've seen over and over again over the last few years. People trying different things, interactive TV, betting online, whatever else. And it's already established technology for all of the encoded channels that you need the set-top box to decode to watch, or through cable or satellite. So the concept makes sense. It's just the fact that this is going to be coming through the PC for the foreseeable future, and that text on the screen is going to be the primary source of information on the web. Making television sets the wrong delivery device is the one thing that they haven't sort of really identified and figured out yet.
Absolutely. Also on the M&A side of things, Spectrum Holobyte buys Bulletproof.
With the growing console market eating more and more of the gamer dollar, flight sim aficionados, Spectrum Holobyte have purchased Bulletproof Software USA, famous for porting Tetris to the NES for Nintendo.
Yeah, and this deal makes some sense because Spectrum could use some strengthening in the console market. And the two companies were very close because of the whole Tetris thing. Hank Rogers first discovered Tetris when Spectrum Holobyte was demoing it. They kept in touch, and Hank Rogers very much assured the Spectrum Holobyte folks. Well, let me back up. And then Spectrum Holobyte was granting him rights, some rights that they didn't end up having the rights to give, but they were trying to play square with him, and they helped him preserve what they could when things blew up through no fault of Spectrum Holobyte's own. And in return, Hank Rogers told the Spectrum Holobyte people to don't worry. As the rights things got more complex, I'll make sure that, you guys and your PC rights aren't impacted by all of this stuff that's going on. So there was some closeness between Gilman Louie and the Spectrum folks and Hank Rogers. So it makes sense that they could get a deal done.
Just for clarification for our listeners, Gilman Louie is the head of Spectrum Holobyte, and Hank Rogers is over at Bulletproof Software.
Absolutely.
Cool. Thank you. And that's totally something we got right on the first take. Now.
Absolutely it is. And now bearing the lead a little bit, because here's a big one. Sony buys Psygnosis.
Psygnosis.
Yes, Psygnosis.
Gotta get that one. So, UK publisher Psygnosis, famous for their Lemmings and Shadow of the Beast franchises, has been purchased by Sony. Psygnosis will continue to publish games under their own name, as well as games for Sony's ImageSoft line.
This was a deal that at the time it went down perplexed every single last person in the game business. Why is Sony buying a company whose only really, really massive hit, the Lemmings franchise, wasn't even created by them? And Shadow of the Beast wasn't even created by them either, even if you consider that a second hit. It's like they're buying a publisher that has nothing. Why are they doing this? But what they missed, what they didn't realize, is Psygnosis was really, really early on certain types of streaming video technology and on CD technology. And they were buying them not for their game library, but for their technology expertise. And Psygnosis is actually the company that builds the original PlayStation development systems. In addition to ending up giving them, the hit game Wipeout and all of that as well. But it wasn't about the games. It was all about the technology, and it was so smart. They were such an important part in Sony's rise to dominance with the PlayStation.
And another element here, in addition to the technology, because for those not in the know, Psygnosis makes their bones. Psygnosis rises out of the ashes of Imagine, company whose an English developer whose fall we will be covering very shortly in the 40-year jumps. And if you haven't seen the wonderful little TV documentary about it, just Google that or go onto YouTube.
Commercial breaks.
Yes. But Psygnosis makes its bones by going 16-bit extremely early on. They make the Amiga their lead platform when nobody is thinking about the Amiga yet. They have a visual style for most of their games that is extremely cutting edge, very much in tune with the culture of teenagers in Europe at the time. I mean, when you look at their games and you look at what is going on in music videos for European techno and so forth, the color schemes, everything matches up. They have their finger on the pulse.
I mean, these are the guys that had Roger Dean design their logo.
Exactly. I mean, you look at the game covers, they almost never have anything to do with the actual game, but the artwork is amazing. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say they capture a zeitgeist. And, a big part, skipping ahead in the story a little bit, but Sony, does so well in Europe. I mean, even in some ways, not in raw sales, but in like mind share, I would argue even better than, say, in the United States. And, and part of that is that they became so dialed in with that techno culture, that house music culture, what not just the teenagers, but also the college students in Europe were into. And that was something that their competitors couldn't match. And not all of that came out of Psygnosis. Some of that came out of just them being already savvy in the music business, etc. But Psygnosis was definitely a big part of that.
Oh, huge. They simply understood what was going to sell to that older demographic, that late teenager, early 20-something demographic, which is exactly what Sony was going after, which is the continuation of what we've been talking about, those kids that started with the NES age. And in Europe, all those people who, like me, were Amiga users in their teens.
Yep.
The moment I saw Wipeout, the moment I saw Destruction Derby, I knew, okay, that's Psygnosis. That just reeks of Psygnosis, of Reflections. That same people who made Shadow of the Beast made Destruction Derby.
Yep.
So they're buying not only for the technology, and let's face it, if you're on the Amiga that early, you're always looking at the tech. The tech was always in the forefront.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, they were really the first company that approached Europe in a savvy and holistic way. And no doubt because Sony as a brand and Sony Music as a brand were already worldwide entities. I mean, yeah, Sega had some success, with Mastertronic and everything, but I mean, it's not the same. This was the first company that was really like, okay, we can make a humongous push into being a real leader in Europe, and we can make that mean something. We can take the market away from the computers. That even as the Genesis was starting, or the Mega Drive in Europe was starting to gain more followers, the various computer platforms were always lurking in the background. But once Sony lands, then it's just like America and Japan. It's console first.
It's console first, and it really just grabbed that market segment in Europe that had always been home computer buyers. The reason why the NES and the Master System never really could compete against the C64 and the Amiga, and it just replaced those machines at that price point, especially because, let's face it, everybody was burning the CDs.
Yep.
That it just worked on so many levels. But, okay.
Yep.
And yes, I knew I was bearing the lead. That's why it was one of the top ones. But it was hard to figure out. I mean, I didn't even know that this happened this month. None of the major American magazines even mentions it. There's one brief mention in Game Player's PC Entertainment, and it's not even a standalone article. They're just talking about something else, and they mention on the sideline that Psygnosis was recently purchased, because
nobody cared. Yeah. Because, Psygnosis at that time was Lemmings, and everyone knew that Lemmings wasn't actually Psygnosis. It was DMA Design. So it's like, okay, Sony, look at Sony, the newcomer here, doesn't even know the right studios to buy. Hardy har har is basically what the response was. It was not seen as a big deal at the time.
Yeah. Gotta love it. Gotta love it.
Meanwhile, EA goes to Sesame Street.
Electronic Arts has signed a deal with the Television Workshop to bring Sesame Street characters to games. This will lay the foundation for EA Kids, Electronic Arts' new educational line of software with a distinct focus on multimedia.
Yeah, I mean, this is, again, before games like Seventh Guest and Myst kind of tilted the entire CD-ROM thing towards games. The initial pitch where they were trying to convince people to bring CD-ROM and multimedia PCs into the home was education. Your child will be left behind if they can't get that set of encyclopedias or they can't get that interactive software that has video and audio to enhance their learning experience. So this is a period of time where there was a real gold rush in trying to snap up educational software on CD-ROM because that was the original pitch. That's what was going to make the difference in the home for people buying multimedia PCs.
Exactly. And it didn't materialize. It didn't really go anywhere. Now, EA Kids is going to be around for a few years. They're going to release a bunch of titles. But the Sesame Street thing gets killed off relatively quickly. There's only, I think, 2 or 3 titles. And then they go off with some other in-house created characters, kid mystery type things, and that's it.
Because as it always turns out to be, it's educational software, never really does that well, and it's just the hassle of working with the licensee doesn't make up for the fact that nobody really cares is I think what it comes down to. But at this exact moment, there was a real belief across the industry that educational software was the way into the CD-ROM multimedia market. So it's no surprise that EA was making this attempt.
Oh, definitely.
All right, let's... Double Dragon coming to TV.
Yeah. 13 half-hour episodes of a Double Dragon cartoon have been ordered.
And we all lived happily ever after.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked already how the announcement was made that Double Dragon was coming to theaters. So I guess it makes sense that they're also going to be launching a cartoon show.
Transmedia, baby.
Yeah, with a relatively similar looking dynamic, if you will, sort of the weird sci-fi future setting and all this, but it's
absolutely
not good. We're going to get Double Dragon 5 using the aesthetic of the cartoon, but yeah, the less said about that, the better.
And we will end this look back at July 1993 with one of the legendary, memorable moments on the game developer side of the video game industry as Chris Crawford gives his Dragon speech at CGDC.
The 7th Annual Computer Game Developers Conference bore witness to one of the greatest moments in game design history when former Atari 8-bit evangelist Chris Crawford gave his now famous "I Had a Dream" speech on the opening day. The speech would mark the end of an era with him retiring to create some kind of greater magnum opus game experience that would never materialize, and seemed to set the tone for a conference that saw a reunion of many of Infocom's brightest who reminisced about the company's glory days, juxtaposed with the rise of Sillywood and the many media companies such as Sony that had just recently purchased Psygnosis, LucasArts basking in the glory of their newly acquired Star Wars rights, Viacom, who now owned ICOM, and Walt Disney, Trimark, and more, all present at the show.
Yep. Very, very famous with his sword, and at the end, charging off into the audience.
Yeah, because he had a dream about interactive entertainment and what it could and should be, and he was not going to be seen again, or, well, he's going to be seen again, but he was going off to do it, and he still has, I guess he's still working on it 30 years later, trying to make the ultimate parser game, as far as I understand it.
And if you would like to invest in that, I've also got some great oceanfront property in Florida to sell you as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great speech. There's a link to the YouTube video of it down in the show notes. It's an interesting show. There's also a keynote given by Harlan Ellison, where he tries to be nice to video games, even though he hated computers. But
to be fair, he hated just about everything.
Yeah, that's true. He was just a curmudgeon. And but it's mainly because he's already at that point working on the video game version of I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream.
Yes.
So that's why he's there. Other big moments of this show, LucasArts shows off Rebel Assault, which I guess it in many ways is another avenue of where CD-ROM is going, and in many ways it's just a rehash of where Astron Belt went 10 years earlier. Sam and Max Hit the Road and The Dig are both shown off. Now this is when Brian Moriarty's still working on The Dig. Both of them supposedly due in 1993. Only one of them is going to show up in 1993.
Three project leaders later.
Yeah, exactly. The Dig is we'll talk about it when it finally comes out, I think. If you really want to know more about The Dig, Jimmy Marr did a great blog entry on the history of it.
No, I was just going to say, and, I know you were being, again, for somewhat good reason, a little dismissive of Rebel Assault, but, as someone who was there at the time, like, it was like being in a Star Wars movie. And this is after we had no new Star Wars movies since Return of the Jedi as well, before the prequels and everything. So even though, looking back in hindsight, it's a pretty pedestrian on-rails shooter, at the time, it's like, whoa, I'm actually, in an X-Wing. This is amazing.
This is true. And I need to give the game its due. It just never quite worked for me. I mean, I never made it out of the damn trench. The trench level. I magically just kept hitting the walls even though I had no depth perception. I think they could have gone more the route of Microcosm, even more blatantly simple, basically just Gyrus clone with some cool backgrounds. But that's another issue.
And also let's just say that once X-Wing hit, we realized we didn't need full motion video to live out our fantasies of being a Rebel pilot. And once X-Wing hit, I never gave the time of day to Rebel Assault again. It's like, okay, this is what I really want.
Exactly. See, that's the thing. Or, if you're doing that, it's post-Comanche. And I had played Comanche at a friend's house extensively. I love that game. I still remember I pulled off this maneuver where I knew the enemies were coming. I saw them on the radar. I just lowered my helicopter into one of the valleys with one of the little rivers in it. And I could see them pass over me. And then I just pulled up behind them. And I felt like I was an Airwolf. Just pulled up behind them, locked on missiles, and boom, 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 boom.
Yeah.
That could have been the trench run in Rebel Assault.
Mm-hmm.
You do it with voxels, done. It just felt like, some parts of that game did not need to be constructed the way they were. I understand why they did, but just didn't work for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, okay. That
felt short. After that last one, feels like we barely covered anything.
This is still going to be almost a 2-hour episode, so I think everybody needs a break. Listeners, if you're still with us at this point, thank you for listening. Remember, if you can spare $1 a month, join the Patreon just to let me know that you're enjoying this. And other than that, send us your comments. Leave your comments on the YouTube and whatever else. And remember, always check out Alex's amazing podcast, They Create Worlds. And if you're not already listening to that, but you're listening to this I'm going to be a little self-deprecating here. You've probably chosen poorly. Also pick up Alex's book, links in the show notes below. What else are we missing?
Well, I think we need to sum up. I think we need the word of the day.
The word of the day, yes. What is the word of the day?
The word of the day is networking. We have all of these companies trying to figure out what video games look like in a connected world.
Very, very true. That, and also companies buying other companies, which is a way of a form of networking as well when you think about it.
I suppose that's true.
Yeah, there you go. So, okay, networking. Very good choice. I love it. Then, everybody, have fun.